Okay, good morning and welcome everyone to our Friday edition, our Eid of Shabbat Parashat class edition. This week, of course, is Perashat Tissa. And we owe Moshe Rabbeinu a great deal of gratitude, a debt of gratitude to Moshe Rabbeinu. Not just because he connected heaven and earth and he was the conduit to bring our Torah to us. He's our greatest prophet of all time. Not just because in this parasha itself, he single-handedly saved Am Yisrael from, God forbid, annihilation at the hands of God and the aftermath of Het HaEgel, but because of a conversation that we're going to look at this morning, and a conversation that we can say, and we are definitely behooves us to look into this conversation, to familiarize ourselves with the conversation, to read and study this conversation. And the first reason is that we can say that this is on a philosophical and conceptual level. I think it's fair to say the deepest and most powerful conversation ever recorded in our Torah and therefore in the history of mankind. That is what we're going to call the dialogue that took place between Moshe Rabbeinu and HaKadosh Baruch Hu. We're going to look at that dialogue, and we're going to give a couple of critical reasons behind why I believe it behooves us to familiarize ourselves with that dialogue. As I said, the first one is that you won't get a more deep and philosophical exchange between man and God. The very idea, the very thought of, let alone man speaking to God and communicating with him, and speaking as directly as Moshe Rabbeinu did, with no conduit, with no liaison, with no dream state, fully conscious, in direct mode of communication, with no hinting, no indirect, passive type of riddles or other means of prophecy, as Rabbi explains this very clearly. But he actually was able to and had the bravery and confidence to breach the type of topics and ask the type of inquiries to God that we would never imagine that a person could get away with. Besides that, there are two other critical reasons that I want to present to you this morning that is the reason why I believe we should familiarize ourselves with this conversation. So we're going to share a screen right now. We're going to look at this dialogue, get a little bit of an overview, and then we'll come back and discuss. So here we go. There is what I call Perashat Tissa, the ultimate dialogue. Hope everyone can see it. And this conversation begins before Moshe Rabbeinu even descended the mountain, in what was the greatest defense that anyone could muster and present on behalf of a client, so to speak. All defense attorneys eat your heart out. We had Moshe Rabbeinu, and it continued in the immediate aftermath of the sin of the golden calf of Het HaEgel, and then extended. And it's that extended part of the conversation that we see these philosophical issues come up. But I broke this down in almost a play-like manner, lahavdil, with Moshe and Hashem, and there are skippings of Pesukim. You'll see that I did a note in the beginning which Pasuk is being quoted, sometimes part of a Pasuk, spanning over Perek Lamed Bet and Lamed Gimel. So if you want to open your Chumash, chapter 32, verse Pasuk Yud Bet 12, and then we'll follow with skipping along this chart over here. So we know Moshe Rabbeinu in essence, and we're not going to analyze the attempt that he made, successful attempt, to save the Am Yisrael from the wrath of God and the potential annihilation of the nation. But suffice it to say, in this top line, Moshe Rabbeinu told Hashem, God, I'm asking you to return or to come back to your normalized state and to retrieve what you decreed, the evil on your nation. And a couple of Pesukim later, it says, indeed, Hashem says, on that second line, God, so to speak, changed his mind and reconsidered that decree. Later on, after Moshe descends and he sees the sin of the golden calf and the difficult scene which ensues, and Moshe's communication to Aaron, etc., he continues this communication with Hashem. And that really was what becomes the dialogue, an exchange between man and prophet, the likes of we've never seen. Something faintly similar, maybe with Abraham Avinu, but this type of dialogue, no, only here. And in it, in Pasuk Lamed Berim on the third line, Moshe tells Hashem, Tissa hatatam. Listen, if you're going to uphold and essentially forgive their sin, fine. Famously, he says, otherwise, I don't want to be, if they're not here, I don't want to be here. Take me out of the book. God, of course, did not acquiesce to that request. But 2 Pesukim later, HaKadosh Baruch Hu tells him, Hashem, line 4 there, Pasuk Lamed Daled, Va'ata, lech nahet ha'ama ela shedibarti lach. You can console the people. You can tell them, Hinei malachi elech lefanecha, I'll have a messenger going, but to lead them. However, Yom puchti ufachti alehem hatatam. When I punish them, I will punish them. Meaning that to some extent, he did agree to Moshe Rabbeinu's request for forgiveness, because this punishment, so to speak, would be spread over time, as Hachamim tell us. We continue. I put there a parenthetic remark, and that is, in the midst of all this, the narrator, God in the Torah, explains to us an incredible sentence, which is that Moshe spoke to Hashem, panim el panim. We can imagine such a thing. Of course, it's a metaphor, face to face with God, and that implies the greatest level of prophecy. But let's move on. In the next chapter, Pasuk Lamed Gimal, is where the extension of this conversation takes place. And here where Moshe Rabbeinu really digs in with his requests. Thus far, as far as we know, God refuses to be amongst the people in a Shekhinah. His presence will not dwell amongst them, even though he won't annihilate them, and to some degree is forgiving them. But Yomer Moshe Adonai, you told me to guide the nation. Who's our guide? Who's our leader? An angel, a messenger. And supposedly I find favor in your eyes. So what's it going to be? So let me tell you, Hashem, that I really, really want you back amongst the nation. However, in the midst, Moshe Rabbeinu gets at another request, which I'll get to. So I'm going to skip Pasuk Lamed Yud Gimal for the moment and come back to it. And what Hashem tells Moshe in the next one, in Pasuk Yud Daled, Vayomed Panay Yelechu V'Anichoti Lach. According to most opinions, I'll say, God has not yet agreed to come back. There's some that say that he did. I'll go with the ones that say that God has not yet acquiesced to retrieve his Shekhinah's divine presence amongst the nation. And here he says, seemingly pretty clearly, I will go and I'll leave you. I'll be somewhere around, but I won't be directly involved. Moshe says in the next line, we're not interested. No deal, says Moshe. If you don't go, we don't go. We don't want to leave over here. And he continues in the next pasuk, and I have some underlines here because the underlines are the requests, which I'll get back to. In the next pasuk, essentially, Moshe Rabbeinu asks for 2 things. He says, how will I know that I really find favor in your eyes? Only if you're actually agreeing to go with us. We need you back in our midst. And then, then we'll be separate, distinct, and different from all the other nations. According to the Gemara, Here Moshe Rabbeinu not only asked for God's presence to return, but to have that exclusive presence to the, with the exception of all other nations, the exclusion of all other nations. Only to us will have such a presence. And look at the response in Pasuk Yud Zayin. V'yomer Adonai el Moshe, gam et hadavar hazeh shedibata ya'aseh. Yes, I will do. Now, let's catch our breath and back up for a second. Let me go back up to the top. Let's try to add up what's been accomplished so far. So Moshe Rabbeinu says, please don't annihilate the people. God says, fine, you win. He says, well, how about forgiving them? Yeah, to some degree I will, says God. Wonderful. Now I insist, God, please bring your presence back. And in fact, leverage. You don't go, we don't go. And I want that presence to be exclusive. Yes, says God. Moshe Rabbeinu was on an incredible roll. But in the midst of this role where he's asking, you can say, the practical questions, he's able to get some of his, you can say, more deep inquiries in, his, we'll call, conceptual questions. And therefore, rolling back up to Pasuk Yud Gimal, where I sort of skipped, he asked the following. If I really find favor in your eyes, please show me your ways. The Gemara says Moshe Rabbeinu was asking to understand the ways of God in terms of justice, in terms of Sadiq v'Ra'lo v'Rasha v'Tovlo, why we don't see the good and evil receiving what they should in this world. Why don't we necessarily see justice clear and blatantly in this world? Show me the ways and how you calculate and how you put all the variables together, God, and make decisions. According to some, Moshe Rabbeinu was also asking about the essence of our eternal existence in Olam Haba, and really asking about a lot of what we don't see in this world in terms of the way that God conducts himself. And the positive and affirmative answer that God gave a few Pesukim later included the affirmative in this, and that is, yes, I will indeed present and reveal to you my ways. Again, we're not really studying the depth of this, and I urge you to look into this on your own, what those ways are and what indeed did Hashem reveal to Moshe Rabbeinu. But here's the buildup. After all these yeses and a few other inquiries that he was able to insert in the procedure of this buildup, Moshe Rabbeinu took the opportunity because, as we said, he's on a roll and he is getting positive answers. He's eliciting all the responses that he wants from God. And this is what's called an Ait Rason. This is a classic time of prayers being answered and hearkened to. And Moshe Rabbeinu says, why not? I might as well go for it. And therefore, down here in the second to last line, he asked the question, the most difficult question ever asked by a man to God. And that is, Pasuk Yud Het, Vayomar Hareni na et kebodecha. God, please let me see your honor, or immediately let me see your honor. And according to our great Hachamim, Rambam and Moreh Nebuchim, the Ramban, Rabbeinu Bachya, and etc. and onward, Moshe Rabbeinu was asking to understand the essence of the existence of God. And of course, a few Pesukim later, God refused, and he told him, Lo yirani ha'adam v'hai. A living man was not meant to know this, and even able possibly to continue living knowing this information. But here's where I present to you the second reason why it behooves us to read this conversation. Because in this dialogue, Moshe asks what we always want to ask. He tries his best to know and discover what we always wanted to know. He inquires, he seeks the truth, he asks God for help to understand the truth. And this is, in a sense, an incredible model for us, where Moshe Rabbeinu shows us that we need to seek the truth. We need to try to find out about God as much as we possibly could. Here, if we can compare these two requests up here in Pasuk Yud Gimel, Hudi'ani na derachecha, show me your ways, and in Pasuk Yud Het, 5 later, Hareni na kibudecha, show me your essence. Moshe Rabbeinu did his best. He asked what we would call, and what the Rabbeinu Bahaya calls in his introduction to Sefer Bereshit, the attainable, what man can conceive of, and the attainable information. And God, indeed, to an extent that I guess no one else was ever able to, showed Moshe and revealed to him God's ways. But ladies and gentlemen, we can, to a great extent, know God's ways. As the Hachamim tell us, first of all, just understanding God's natural order of things, his universe, his earth, is a way of getting to know and love God. Studying the world, understanding our surroundings, thinking all the time in a godly manner, is educating ourselves in the ways of God. That is a paradigm that Moshe Rabbeinu set out for us in terms of the necessary questions we must ask. And then to contrast that is the unattainable. As the Rabbeinu Bahya explains, as it says in the book of Mishleh, Kavod HaMelech Hester Davar. There's certain things about the king we're not supposed to know, we'll never know. The essence of God is inattainable, not meant for a human being to ever conceive of. But he gave it a shot because he wanted so badly to understand the essence of God. But the answer is also a paradigm for us, and that is, don't go too far. There is a certain line which we should not cross in our intellectual pursuits and our great will to find the truth in this world. Sometimes there's a line which crossing it will be a danger to us. And sometimes if we're not ready, may confuse us and be perhaps counterproductive and bring us to a place that we don't want to, a confusion, God forbid. And therefore Moshe Rabbeinu showed us what the attainable was and the unattainable, and what we should and should not acquire. But asked and inquired and tried what we always wanted to ask and know. And that's the first major reason why I believe that we need to get familiarized with this conversation. But let me bring you back now and give you what the second and final reason I believe is. And that's because, as I showed you in the midst of that dialogue, the Torah shared with us an incredible fact. And that is, and Moshe Rabbeinu spoke to God, panim el panim kasher yedaber ish al ra'ehu. So to speak, metaphorically speaking, that God spoke to Moshe face to face like a man speaks to his friend. And of course, that means, as the Rambam explains, that he had this prophecy that no one else had. But gentlemen, are you understanding and realizing that after that statement was made that he had achieved the highest level of prophecy, that is when the extension of that dialogue took place. It is then when the questions were asked. He had already achieved and reached the place where no man can and will ever reach. He is already communicating with God at a higher level that is imaginable and possible. His prophecy is more direct than was ever and will ever be. And yet, Moshe, unsatisfied, not content, began at that point his surge towards incredible inquiries, his aspirations to know. Isn't it enough? What a high bar does Moshe Rabbeinu set for us. But that's the point. There's a Gemara, Masechet Hagigah, where a Hakam known as Ben Hehe, he's actually the last quoted Hakam in Pirkei Avot, where it says, Lefum Sa'ara Agra, according to the pain is the reward. And in that Gemara, Masechet Hagigah, Ben Hehe, who some commentaries say was a convert, asked the legendary Hillel HaZaken, and he quoting a pasuk from the book of Malachi, which says that you're going to see in the future Ma ben Sadiq la Rasha, the difference between a righteous man and a evil man, and ben Oved Elohim Asher lo Avado, and between he who worships God and he who doesn't. And he asked Hillel, what's the difference between a righteous person and someone who worships God? It seems to be synonymous. And Hillel answers him with the really famous answer, and that is, you can't compare someone who has studied and reviewed his Torah 100 times to the one who has learned and studied and reviewed 101 times. Asked Ben Hehe, it's one more time. Are you kidding me? And answered Hillel, that is just the point. The point is there's no such thing in terms of growth, in terms of intellectual understanding, knowledge of Torah, godly understanding, personal growth. There's no such thing as a plateau. There's no such thing as reaching a point. There's no such thing as being content. It's a never-ending quest for greatness, for knowledge, for growth, for intellectual, conceptual depth of understanding of philosophical pursuits. It doesn't end. Our building of Torah, knowledge of Torah, our fostering relationship with God, there is no such thing as satisfaction. And that, modeled to us by our Rabbi Moshe Rabbeinu in this parasha, is the other reason why that dialogue is so critical for us. Because it's after the Torah testifies to the fact that he had reached what we would think is a plateau, a pinnacle of human accomplishment that is incomparable and we would think would lead to contentness and satisfaction, and quite the contrary. It is from there that Moshe Rabbeinu began his pursuit for knowledge. That's when he put his inquiries into overdrive, into the next gear. And that is where Moshe Rabbeinu modeled for us that we simply never stop growing. We study, we learn, we reach one point, and we wake up the next morning and we want more, and we take the next step. That was demonstrated to us by a great Hacham, the greatest prophet of all time, in this week's parasha, in the dialogue in Tissa by Moshe Rabbeinu. First, the depth of the questions we always wanted to ask, but then the idea of never stopping to ask, never stopping to grow. And for that, we owe him a great debt of gratitude. Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom. Questions?